Well, I'll say before I tell you the backstory that can also be a challenge. It's
Yes.
obviously it's inspiring, but at the same time, I'm never going to be a better lyricist than Craig Finn.
Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm thrilled as always to be here with you. I'm excited for this episode to introduce to you Mr. Franz Nicolay. Now, Franz, as you'll hear, is a long-standing member of the Hold Steady. I've been I've been a fan of the Hold Steady since the early 2000s, and it's always been on my bucket list to have Franz on the show. So it's a thrill to speak with him. As you'll hear, his background is incredibly diverse. I don't think anyone needs convincing that New York has an amazing music scene or music scenes, as Franz explains. And we hear about that and a lot more, and even some funny conversation at the end about Roland amps and a whole bunch, and some great train wrecks as well. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it, and I'll talk to you at the end of the show. Franz, thank you, sir, for joining us. It's an absolute buzz and pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
So let's talk about 2023 to kick off. I know you've had a busy year on a number of fronts. Tell us about your last 12 months and what you've been up to.
Yeah, it was a busy Hold Steady year because it was the 20th anniversary of the band. So we did we were a lot more active than we usually are at this point. And then I did a solo tour in England and some other stuff like that. That's been, and I have a teaching job, so it was a lot
going on.
There's a lot going on.
Yeah, and we're absolutely going to talk about the Hold Steady in a sec. So tell us about your solo tour of England. What was the impetus for that, and how did that go?
I had a solo record out last year, I guess it was. New River. It's my fifth, I think. And England, for whatever reason, has always been the place where people are into my solo records. So I was happy to go back there.
Yeah,
and I piggybacked it on the Hold Steady does an annual March residency in London, and so figured, well, I'm there already. That's one less plane ticket to buy.
That's right.
Stay over there for a couple more weeks.
So let's briefly talk about New River, because it's an incredible album. I've had a few listen to it. I love all the songs, but things like the Morris column, it's a very different album to what people would expect, obviously, from you in the Hold Steady, but also your previous bands that we'll talk about in a minute. So just tell us about that last album and how the creative process flowed for you making that, and its reception too, I suppose.
It was a record, I was really focused on solo records from 2009 to 2015 or so, and then took a couple of years off because I had young kids. But I had still been accumulating songs, and I was doing a lot of writing in that period too. And I sort of have the same slush pile for words that can get funneled into the books or into the songs. And it was a pandemic project, like a lot of people did. I think I found myself with some time on my hands and started putting together a folder of the songs I'd been writing over the previous years, and to see what I had on hand, and had some instrumentals that needed words and had some words that needed instrumentals. So, just put them together put them together one on top of the other.
No, absolutely. And I'm not a big fan of putting music into boxes and genres, but if you had to describe the album, what for people that are looking to have a listen, how would you describe it?
I mean, it's a songwriter record. It's very much a songwriter record. The solo act I usually call it's like a songwriter cabaret act. I'll get up there with my guitar and banjo and accordion, and when I was on the road really intensely in the aughts, first with the World Inferno Friendship Society, and then with the Hold Steady, and briefly with Against Me, one of the ways I filled my time and sort of made sense of the life that I found myself living was by going to used bookstores and buying old show business biographies or memoirs and biographies, both. The sort of like the Jimmy Durantes and John Barrymores of the world, these people who came up through vaudeville. Just the sense of the idea of, to be a traveling entertainer was not the idea that it's not a new profession, and that there could be a kind of dignity to it, and that you could do it for a lifestyle, and find a community in those sort of peripatetic people, and take a little pride in the idea that you could get up in front of a room full of strangers and make them pay attention to you and make them feel like that attention was worthwhile. And so one of the reasons that I wanted to do solo touring at that point in my career was that I had sort of been for a decade playing in very loud bands. And there's a way in which that's a kind of a crutch when you're in front of strangers, and you've got a crew of people around you. And so even if the show went poorly, you have, I guess I just wanted the challenge of being a little more exposed to get up Saint Sebastian like in front of a room full of people and see if I could hold their attention myself. So that kind of like old fashioned showbiz quality of like tell a story, tell a joke, sing a song, make them laugh, make them cry.
That's great. And I know, speaking of exposed, it's probably a good juncture to go back to your start in music, where all of us feel exposed when we first start out. So tell us a little bit about your musical upbringing. What first ignited your passion for music? And it's purely only a guess, Franz, but I'm assuming the accordion plays a role in there.
Not till later. I grew up in a very rural area of New Hampshire in the northeast of the United States. My parents were sort of back to nature types in the 70s, artists. So it's a little bit isolated. They tell me that the spark was that I saw Yitzhak Perlman on Sesame Street and said I wanted to play the violin. And they were both artists and so supportive of, they were not musicians, but they were supportive of creativity in the kids. So they got me a violin, they got me a violin teacher. And the other thing that I had acquired at some point around then was a box set of cassettes and a little Walkman, and the cassette was these sort of narrated lives of the great composers, quote unquote. So you would listen to a side of the cassette and it would tell you about Dvorak, and it would put in chunks of the music, and I would listen to that, and I, again in this sort of half-formed elementary school way, I was like, I'm going to be a composer, but my violin teacher also was, she let me, I took staff paper and wrote notes on the staff paper, and I played it on the violin regardless of what it sounded like, and she let me include that in my recitals. And so I just sort of had the idea that this was something you could do, and started playing piano a year or two later, picked up French horn in 4th grade, started playing guitar in middle school, as you do. My dad, the accordion came from my dad. He came from a German immigrant family. His grandfather had brought a little Hohner over from Germany so that his son could play him polkas and waltzes. And they had put him in a accordion orchestra on Long Island in the 50s, and he hated it. The family story is that he took a knife to the bellows once because he didn't want to go to accordion orchestra anymore. But his parents were made of sterner stuff than that. They taped him up and sent him. But he still had the little Hohner around the house. And I got interested in it because I got really into the band as a high schooler. And so just sort of looking at that cover of the Basement tapes where they have they have mandolins and they have accordions and stuff like that. So I didn't really start playing the accordion seriously until much later, but I did take it with me when I moved to New York. And I bought myself a mandolin as a high school graduation present with the dishwashing money. And so I went to New York when I was 17 to go to NYU as a music student. The they offered a split major where I could study jazz piano and classical composition, not because I had ambitions necessarily to be a jazz pianist or a classical composer, but so I could have the full toolkit when I went out into the world, which is basically what I did. I just sort of opened up the back of the Village Voice, which was the free weekly at the time, and answered all the ads for all the various gigs that you could have, and most of them were shit gigs, but then you meet the other people who are doing the same thing, and maybe you have a beer afterwards and talk about what a shit gig it was, and then they have a cool gig that doesn't pay any money, but they call you up, and that's how it spirals from there. But yeah, I played guitar in R&B covers band. I played piano for in little musical theater, gay cabarets in the West Village. I would transcribe. I would make lead sheets for singers who wanted to sing various songs and needed chord charts, and it was also training wheels in terms of making a cassette demo of my songs and making the packages that you used to have to make with the one sheet, and calling all the booking agents for the crappy little Bleecker Street clubs. Calling him again 10 days later, and calling him again 10 days later, all that sort of like low stakes stuff for an 18, 19-year-old that, but at least you don't have to be starting fresh, starting from scratch.
No, that's right. And so, Franz, do you remember when you first had the perception, okay, I'm playing a non-shit gig?
Yeah. Well, the first band I joined, there were a couple, but there was a band called World Inferno Friendship Society,
yes,
which was a 9-piece anarchist circus punk collective. I took a sublet. I sublet a room from a woman and her husband she was the bass player in this band, and I went to see them on a Halloween night in Williamsburg, and her story is that I didn't talk to her for a couple of days, and she thought I hated it. I think I was just hungover. But I was sort of like, that was amazing if you ever need a keyboard player. And it turned out they were in the market for a new keyboard player. So, a month later I was in that band. And that was the first band I did serious touring with. I had done, out of town one-offs here and there with various groups, but that was the first time I did 10 days down the East Coast, or, went to Germany. And that was also my first experience with building a band from playing for, 25 people at Brownies to selling out the Bowery Ballroom to playing for 500 people to playing for 1,000 people. I mean, that was the really exciting moment. Yeah. But I had also met their sax player through a totally different gig, so it's like we sort of ran into each other at Eula's apartment, and we're like, what are you doing here? It becomes a small scene after a while. And I was sort of trying to make the scene in all kinds of ways. And be a part of, be a part of as many things as I could, and with the idea that one of them would stick.
And I mean, that one obviously stuck as far as longevity, because if I've got my facts right, Franz, you were in that for sort of 7 years and then back for a few years. And then I assume some sort of sit-in or reunion back in 2019. It's an incredible band that I've had the pleasure of watching over the last few days. I won't profess that I was aware prior, but what stood out to me is just, how diverse that music is, and what a great first gig to have.
It was a really profound experience in all kinds of ways. It was really musically sophisticated and ambitious. There were a couple of us who were trained musicians, jazz music, myself and Peter Hess, the clarinetist and saxophonist, and a bunch of people who were extremely sophisticated musicians, self-taught musicians. And it was a band that really operated like a democracy in a way that bands sometimes claim to do, but rarely actually do. For good or ill, you're talking about a 9-piece band. It took a long time to come to any decisions. But it did mean that everybody had a stake in the thing. and it really felt like a gang. And it was, and the singer was someone who was, 9 years older than me and had been in punk rock in the New Jersey tri-state area, and really became like a mentor figure, again, for good or ill. And yeah, I never wanted to leave that band. I desperately tried to stay in it long past the time when it was realistic, because I had joined the Hold Steady, and the Hold Steady had become this rocket ship that was taking off, and I was really trying to stay in both bands really long past the time where it was made any sense for either, or was fair to either band.
Yeah.
But just to make the point about my emotional connection to that band.
No, absolutely. And Franz, this is the band that had very special Halloween gigs. You mentioned that you saw them first on a Halloween gig. Tell us a little bit about that tradition within the band.
It was a band that featured a lot of self-mythologizing, as many bands do, but for whatever reason, the Halloween gig for World Inferno became the centerpiece of the year. We would pull out all the stops and try to top ourselves each year in terms of stagecraft and making it a real spectacle. And I don't know why, other than that they had written a song called Pumpkin Time, sort of a gospel homage to the Great Pumpkin, the Charlie Brown. And that became a kind of anthem, but that we would only play once a year on Halloween. You pick up on certain things that come up in lyrics or art or conceptually, and they take on a life of their own.
That's right. And apologies if I'm not getting the sequence right, Franz, but I'm also fascinated to hear about your role in the jazz quartet Guignol. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and what that meant to you?
Yeah, so like I said, there's small scene, even in New York. The one of the neat things about being in a city like New York is that a lot of cities will have a good music scene. New York has many great music scenes at any given time. And I was trying to be a part of a lot of them. So I had this group, Antisocial Music, which was a composer-performer collective that was doing sort of chamber music stuff, composed music, notated music. So that was one world that I was trying to be a part of. And then this was about the time in the early aughts in New York where there was a huge explosion of interest in Balkan music, which included myself and Peter from World Inferno and Eula, the bass player in World Inferno. We were all there was a couple different clubs that were specializing in that kind of music, and we were just really fascinated. I mean, I remember I had gotten one of our friends worked at the local NPR station, and they had gotten a copy of this Ivo Papazov record, Balkanology. I think it was some sort of bootleg, either Bulgarian clarinetist, some sort of a bootleg, and I had an office job at an ad agency, which was the first time I'd encountered the idea of a CD burner. And so I brought in this cassette and I dumped it into, we had a 4-track Pro Tools. That was the first time I'd ever seen Pro Tools, and burned CDs of this Ivo Papazov record for everybody. Just like, we're trying to count the time signatures. What is this? This is incredible. This is blowing my mind. And so the other piece of that is when I joined World Inferno, I had started playing accordion really seriously for the first time. I had brought the accordion. I had joined as a keyboard player. After a couple rehearsals, it was clear to me, sort of looking around at the band, it's like, hey, see, I got an accordion at home. Should I bring it to rehearsal? Seems like it would fit. And they were like, yeah, absolutely. I really didn't know how to play it. I was a piano player, so I could do the right hand. I hadn't really explored the left hand, like a lot of people when they pick up accordion. The other thing is I had a really strong prescription at the time. And so I was sort of looking down at the right-hand keyboard, was looking under my glasses. So that was a little bit of a challenge. But it didn't really matter because we were in this loud rehearsal space and I didn't have a pickup for the thing. So nobody could hear me play for about 6 months until I got a contact mic finally, and then eventually got a real internal pickup. And by that time, I had sort of figured it out. So I, faked it until and then, accordion players talk about small scenes. The accordion scene in New York was a particularly small scene. But because of this explosion of interest in Balkan music, if you were a half decent accordion player, all of a sudden people would start asking you to guest on things, oh, come play on my record, come sit on the show. And so it really became a part of my persona at the time. Also I dressed up for shows and I had a curly mustache. It was a whole shtick. So Guignol was the band that Peter and I put together to play. We were trying to write music in this style, and some of it became World Inferno songs, and some of it was just clearly never going to become a World Inferno song. And we were friends with the sideshow the Coney Island sideshow. The Bindlestiff Family Circus were people that we knew, and some of them were in the Coney Island sideshow, and they were going to start doing a weekly show at CBGB.
Wow.
And they asked us to put together a band to back up the show. And so that was the excuse to start the band that became Guignol. We called it the Nothing Machine at first, but it was the two of us and a tuba player and a drummer, and we would back up, the Fire Eater Act, or the woman who ate maggots and dog food, on the stage at CBGB. And so we did that. I think we did, 4 or 6 weeks of that. And that ended, but we were like, hey, the band's good. Let's make it happen.
That's amazing. And who said CBGB's wasn't edgy well past its peak?
I mean, it was, by and large, it wasn't, but you did have a thing like that from time to time.
Yeah. Well, no, that's brilliant, Franz. And then, so again, I'm not sure of the link here, but I know you took on some more accordion duties with Voltaire. So that, again, another amazing artist that you spent some time working with. Tell us a little bit how that came about.
I mean, he's just a guy who he hires people to that's a hired gun situation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the long and short of it. He hires people to do his records, and then he goes and does whatever he does at the Comic Cons or the Goth Cons.
Yeah.
So every couple of years, I'll get an email from Voltaire and say, "Hey, I'm going to send you a couple songs. Can you track the accordion and send it back?" It's
yeah.
I haven't seen the guy in 15 years.
No, yeah, so it's transactional. No, I understand.
That's what it is.
But I wanted to pick up, you made a great point when you were part of the collective, and then with the World Inferno Friendship Society, the democracy. It sounds like you've had some interesting collective or democratic band experiences. What, from your learning, have you works and what doesn't work? Like, what are the challenges of that, aside from the time to make decisions? What have you taken forward in your music career of what works well as far as trying to be democratic?
Well, the time to make decisions is a huge challenge. Sometimes you just need to, if you work with management, you often find that the manager likes to speak to one point person in the band rather than trying to organize a band meeting. So that sort of thing is the downside, and it's useful to have a person with a vision. I don't know. I'm still a little bit of a romantic on the idea. I mean, I think there's something to be said for a democracy. One of the things that really can be a festering sore in band situations is about the songwriting credits.
Yeah.
Right. Because these are the things that can create a class system within the band. Right. If the primary songwriters all of a sudden are a lot richer than everybody else. And stay that way, right? Because that's your 401k. You can still get those ASCAP checks after the band breaks up. And so that was something I really appreciated about World Inferno, is that, we had one guy who wrote all the lyrics, but we split everything 9 ways, songwriting wise. And we had legitimately out of those 9 people, I mean, at least 7 people who were contributing music. On the other hand, nobody who's listening to this really needs me to opine, I think, on the problems of band dynamics. But I guess I can plug my upcoming book, which is called Band People, and it's about the working and creative lives of people who have made playing in bands their life, whether on purpose or it's just ended up that way. That's going to be on University of Texas Press in the fall of 24.
Oh, great stuff.
But talking about bands as a kind of group dynamic, as this funny entity that combines small business and chosen family and creative collaboration over, in a lot of cases, many, many years. And in a lot of cases, those arrangements are worked out and formed, and those commitments are made by people who are too young to know what they're signing up for. And so how to navigate all those hierarchies and group dynamics is to me endlessly fascinating. And so I talked to almost 100 different people who are not the main faces of bands to talk about how they think about their role and how they think about where what their investment in their bands are, and what kind of freedoms they think they have, and so on.
Look, yeah, sign me up. Take my money, Franz. I want to read that one already. So let's. I was planning on covering this later, but let's jump to that now. You have another non-fiction publication to your credit, which, if not, I'd argue it's on the same plane. I think it's fair to say about musicianship in the music industry, and then we'll get onto fiction. But talk about your first work and how you use that as, I'm guessing, somewhat of a alternative to the ridiculousness of the road and other things.
Yeah, my first book is called The Humorless Ladies of Border Control. So in the first years when I started doing solo touring, I was using it. I had a couple of examples of people I had run into. I saw that there was a rapper named Sage Francis, who I had been on a tour with. And I saw that he was driving himself around in a little compact car and doing his own merch, and his load-in was just his iPod with his beats on it. And I was like, this guy is onto something. That's jamming econo. He's going to make money every night. His profit margin is excellent. As opposed to having to have a van and a trailer and pay for gas and find places for 5 or 6 or 8 or 9 or 10 people to sleep. And then the group Matt and Kim, the duo who I was friends with from Brooklyn DIY World, I ran into them at an airport once, and they were on their way to Alaska. I said, wow, that's so cool. You're playing in Alaska. And they were like, well, we just, they were a couple. They were like, we wanted to go on a vacation in Alaska. And so we asked our booking agent to book us a show on a backline rig. And then that's our plane tickets, and it's everything else is a tax write-off, and we get to have our week in Alaska. It's like, file that one away. And so once I got comfortable driving myself around on my own tours, I figured out where the places were that I was going to have. I mean, after a little while, you have some data on where your fans are. I knew that I could go to England and make some money. I could go to Germany and make some money. I could go to Poland and make some money. And so every time I would go back, I was booking myself essentially. So I would just make the circle a little bigger and use the week or 10 days in Germany to sort of finance more far-flung places that I was just interested to go to. And so, I would go down to Bulgaria and Romania and Serbia and Croatia, and then I was dating a Ukrainian American woman who's now my wife, and she was an ethnomusicologist, and she was doing field work in Ukraine, in Crimea, and then in the Carpathians. And so when I was still with the Hold Steady, we would finish up a European tour. We would have a couple weeks off. I would just fly over to Kiev or fly to Simferopol or fly to Poland and take the train into Lviv and hang around in Ukraine. So I was developing a real network there. So I did some touring in Ukraine. Then when she finished her doctorate, I had run into a guy from St. Petersburg, and I had talked to him about this idea I had about doing a tour along the Trans-Siberian Railroad. He said, "Great, let me know when you're ready. Essentially, I'll book it for you." And so Maria finished her PhD. She had some time off. She's also an accordion player. That's how we met, that small New York accordion scene. We had overlapping skill sets. So she also played banjo. So if the two of us were traveling, we brought an accordion, a banjo, and a guitar. We could swap instruments. We could harmonize. We could do a couple of her songs. So we made a tour of it. And, it eventually we toured from Eastern Europe all the way out to Beijing.
Wow.
And that was the core tour of that book was that. And then I went back over the next couple of years, culminating in being in Ukraine the year after the Maidan Revolution. Yeah. So essentially that was the book. It's a tour. I call it Tour Diary Plus. It's a travel book. It's thinking about, I've always liked to read about travel books. I like travel literature in general, travel literature about the places that I'm going as I'm going there. And so it was sort of in conversation with some of those other texts as well, and thinking about music scenes and what it means to be politically active in a music scene, and sort of comparing and contrasting the political energy among the DIY and punk scene in Ukraine versus the same scene in Russia, in all kinds of ways that obviously have manifested in the years since then. I mean, these were tours from 2012 to 2015, and you could already see that schism even then. But it's been fascinating and sort of horrifying to watch.
Well,
but one of the inspirations for the book was Rebecca West's Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, and where she goes to the kingdom of Yugoslavia in between World War I and World War II, and she wants to go as an English woman, saying like World War I, which just was devastating to the world that I knew about, was sparked in this part of the world that I didn't know anything about. So let me go there and try to figure out the deep history and figure out what's going on there now and what that can tell me about the future. And she writes this epilogue saying, this is just nothing. She's writing about a time in the 30s where nothing has happened again yet, but she can sort of sense that there's something else bubbling up. And she compares herself to a Roman noblewoman writing in the years leading up to the sack of Rome, right? Like the Visigoths are not there yet, but they're on the outskirts. Even if she wasn't there for the sack of Rome, we would still find that a useful historical document. And that's why she was writing about Yugoslavia in the 1930s. And I sort of felt the same way about writing about Ukraine in 2015.
That's just, that's plain amazing. And just as an aside, Franz, I had no idea your wife had a PhD or was an ethnomusicologist, because when you first mentioned your current book the one that's about to come out, my first thought when you said you'd interviewed over 100 people was, gee, that's a great PhD thesis. So has that ever been something you've considered?
I never felt like I had the 7 years to spare.
Yeah, there is that.
I have a master's in creative writing. That was... I was so, I was the picture of an ambitious young musician in a real hurry. I moved to New York at 17 and had this feeling that if I wasn't famous and successful by 20, that I would be disappointed and feel like a failure, which is hilarious to think about now. But it's that kind of, that was the energy. It's like 7 years. Are you kidding me? Not a chance. I had a teacher when I was an undergrad who was encouraging me to go to grad school. But it's like, that was a non-starter. And then when I finally did go to grad school, it was, it was to get credentialed. I thought I wasn't gonna be a full-time touring musician anymore, and I needed a second career. And so it was sort of like, well, I don't have 7 years. I have a baby. I need to get credentialed in something else ASAP. And it was either that or library science.
Yeah. No, that's great. And so let's talk about your fiction book. Someone Should Pay for Your Pain, because obviously was that generated out of your master's study, like the initial idea, or something you've done? I know it's more recent, but what was the genesis of that?
Well, I had written The Humorless Ladies, which was nonfiction, and I had been invited by various people to write fiction. So I'd written a few short stories and presented them. I had a guy who had published a chapbook of my stories. There's a fellow in Scotland had invited me to contribute to a book he was putting together of short stories based on replacement songs. And so I had written something for that. It sort of seemed like the next challenge after writing The Humorless Ladies would be to try to write book-length fiction rather than to write another piece of nonfiction. I mean, I had you take these these meetings with agents and editors, and they say, hey, well, do you have another project in mind? And you want to have something. And so I was sort of pitching the book that became Band People, but I didn't end up writing it for another however many years. Because I was more excited about the challenge of writing book length fiction. And so I took that short story, from the Replacements book and expanded that.
That's great. And we'll definitely be linking to that. And apologies to our listeners and viewers that are here to talk keyboards and music, but I've got a selfish interest in that. I'm fascinated by writing and writers myself. So I'm unapologetic in going down this route. So one last question on that, Franz, is what for you is the discipline of writing? So as you know, there's no right or wrong way to actually get the words on the page. But for you, what is that discipline to get a novel-length piece of fiction done?
What is that discipline? I mean, I have a slush pile of words. I like words. I'm constantly writing. Even when I was driving around by myself, I kept a notebook in the passenger seat and a big pen so that I could write if I saw a sign, or if I would try to mentally be describing the scenery as it went by. And if I thought I had something good, I could write it down without taking my hand off the road, my eyes off the road, or my hand off the wheel. And then I would sort of transcribe that into my iPhone or my laptop when I got after sound check, whatever I had written, whatever I had scribbled while driving that day, which maybe is why both of my first two books include so many driving montages. There's a lot of driving montage material in the notebooks. But it's basically, it's the same stream as the lyrics. I think sort of poetic writing and prose writing are not fundamentally different. You want a kind of prosody in your prose that's the same kind of rhythm and alliteration and assonance that you look for in lyrics. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. No, I think that's great. And it also makes me think that emphasis both in your lyrics from a solo viewpoint and then your creative writing. I can't think of a better band fit from a lyrics viewpoint than the Hold Steady, because obviously that is one of the most incredibly story-driven bands that I've come across, and I'm a huge fan. So let's talk about how that came about. Let's segue across that. So what led to you, joining Craig and the team in the Hold Steady?
Well, I'll say before I tell you the backstory that can also be a challenge.
Yes.
It's inspiring, but at the same time, I'm never going to be a better lyricist than Craig Finn. So there's always that sort of ceiling. On those ambitions. There's a beautiful memoir by Stuart David, who was the bass player in Belle and Sebastian, on those early records, and he left the band and did his own solo thing for a little while, and now he's transitioned to being a writer. And he wrote this book called Up in the All Night Cafe, which is a memoir of the early years of Belle and Sebastian. And it contains a sentiment which I had never seen captured in a book before, which is the feeling of being a pretty good songwriter, but being in a band with a genius. Which is a feeling that I've had twice in my life now. And so I was happy to see him sort of capture that. Because it's not an easy feeling.
No.
But I have profound respect for what Craig does, and it's just and a kind of awe in a lot of cases. How did that come about? I was in World Inferno, and that was my main gig, and there was a lot happening for World Inferno. World Inferno had met Craig and Tad's old band Lifter Puller, and played a show together in Chicago at the Fireside Bowl, and mutual fandom. We had their CD EP, The Entertainment and Arts, in heavy rotation in the van. Their band broke up. Craig moved to New York. He got a job for a .com that was called DCN, that was in the business of streaming live shows from clubs around the country. It wasn't going that well because at that point nobody had high-speed enough internet at their houses to really watch what they were offering. But they had been trying to break out into live CDs, live records. And so Craig approached World Inferno because we were, I think it's fair to say, one of the one or two biggest punk bands in New York City at the time, and had especially for our live show. And he said, so I got to know Craig really as the A&R guy for the World Inferno live record, live at Holomus at North 6. And that was about the time when we were working on that record, was about the time that Tad had moved to New York, and the two of them had put together the Hold Steady. And at that point, it was a very low-key situation. They were not planning to tour. They were not going to be ambitious in any way. And so when they were making Almost Killed Me, the first Hold Steady record, they asked myself and, again, Peter Hess, my musical life partner, who the sax player in World Inferno, clarinet player in Guignol, multi-winds player in Antisocial Music, best man at my wedding. Anyway, me and Peter went and played on Almost Killed Me, on a bunch of songs. And then they would ask me to come sit in, and if there was a hometown Hold Steady show, I would jump up at the Mercury Lounge or at North 6 and play those 3 or 4 songs. And then at one show, they were like, why don't you play the whole set? I said, okay, I'll play the whole set. And then I think, they were going to make Separation Sunday, that it was half written, and they were going to expand the band. And it was sort of, do we hire another guitar player or do we hire a keyboard player? And they asked me to join the band, reassuring me that it's not going to compete with World Inferno. We're not going to tour. It's going to be low key, no problem. I was like, yeah, great. Sounds great. Love you guys. I'm already in, I'm in 5 bands. What's another one? Doesn't sound like it's going to be a big commitment. Cut to 2 years later.
It's amazing. And look, I probably came into knowing the band around Separation Sunday. And so one of the questions I was really interested to ask you, Franz, is how your involvement has evolved the Hold Steady sound. Because I know, for example, the latest album I just love to bits. And what really stands out to me is that your keyboards are more prominent as time goes on. Because an album like Separation Sunday, when I first heard it, I always listen out for the keyboards, and they're not super prominent. And there are some songs that are just, fall to the floor, brilliant rock songs. What influence do you think you've had? I imagine it's quite significant.
So Separation Sunday, half the record was written when I joined the band, and then half of it was written with me as a very fresh member.
Yes.
So I think it's roughly the first half of the record. And there was another transition too, which is that the old drummer left and Bobby Drake came in. And so half the record was recorded with Judd on drums, and the other half was with Bobby. So half of the songs are just sort of me laying down organ pads, essentially, on existing songs. And then there were a handful that I was there in the room for the writing of. And one of which I wrote, Don't Let Me Explode, the sort of 12/8 jobber. which is piano driven, and also you may notice a piano key. It's in B flat instead of G A E, which was kind of the point.
Yes.
But yeah, I think it was the two songs, Stevie Nicks and Chicago Seemed Tired Last Night, have that piano bridge, the piano breakdown bridge that became a real signature of our songwriting. Because, big rock guitars, there's only so much you can do dynamically, right? Which, can be a problem for keyboard players on stage. The dynamic range of electric guitars plugged into an amp is not large. And so to have a kind of dynamic in the songwriting requires, or it doesn't require, but you all of a sudden you have all these other options, right? All of a sudden you're in widescreen and you have this real cinematic scope. And we started to talk about songwriting in that way, about moving through scenes. Craig's lyrics are so visual anyway and cinematic anyway. And they don't, and there's a tremendous freedom in the way he writes, because for the most part, he doesn't write choruses. He did for a couple records, but even Separation Sunday, point, there was one song in the Hold Steady catalog that had a chorus, Your Little Hood Rat Friend, after two records. And so he could sort of do what he did over anything. And he had done an electronica record in the Downtime, which sort of proved that. So there's a world in which, literally anything we do with Craig Finn doing his thing over the top of it, which is so distinctive, can be a Hold Steady song.
Yes.
And so that was something I was pushing for a long time. It's like, we don't have to be in this box of. Obviously, there's a concept about a bar band classic rock riffage, but there's so much more. Like, we actually have a real freedom here.
It sounds like you certainly do, Franz. So with the music, please correct me if I've got this wrong. It sounds like when you go into the studio to record an album, I'm sure there is obviously concepts in that developed, and Craig's lyrics are driving that. But it sounds like musically there's a lot of freedom and discussion on approach. Can be.
The concept, we don't hear, in a lot of cases, we don't know what the lyrics are until we're in the studio.
Yeah.
We're writing the music, and then he's sort of, in the old days, we would be in the practice room for 3 hours with a case of beer, playing the song over and over again, and he would be sort of mumbling into the mic and scribbling or like paging through his notebooks. These days, it's, we're each individually writing music and demoing it and sending it to him, and he's doing that on his own time. So, there is this really magical moment in the studio where he's tracking his vocals and we all hear the lyrics in full for the first time. And it just, oh my God.
Yeah.
Did you hear that? That's incredible, which we get to do more now. And in the old days, he was very self-conscious about vocal tracking. We weren't allowed to be in the room during those moments. I think the other thing you're hearing is that for the first half of the band's career, Tad was the primary music writer, the guitar player. And I would have a song here and there and a couple B-sides. And now it's much more, we have myself and Tad and Steve, the second guitar player, and even Craig on the last record. We have four of the 6 band members are bringing in music pretty much equally. And so the canvas is a lot more textured.
It is. And just you mentioned about nerding out. This last album, I'm seeing more synths. So tell us about that and what the inspiration was there. Because, it's the opening song, and I apologize, I've forgotten the name of it. But, just brilliant. Yeah, it's called Grand Junction. That's it.
We're 9 records in. You want to broaden the palette a little. I remember I played synth on Separation Sunday, but I don't think most people clocked it. There's that sort of sine wave theremin-y sound on Cattle and the Creeping Things. There wasn't anything like that on Boys and Girls, I don't think. On Stay Positive, I did this. I was trying to do a Cars-y thing, like that, like real Cars style FM synth lead on a song called Navy Sheets, which was roundly hated. But yeah, Philistines, yeah. Classic rock fans can be quite conservative.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things about that benefits the Hold Steady is when we feel like the stakes are not that high, so we can be loose and have fun. When the Hold Steady's having a good time, we're going to make good records. And what was happening a little more, after Stay Positive was it felt there was so much pressure because we had gotten we never got huge, right? We never really had a radio hit, but we definitely had become indie rock darlings very quickly. And so there was a lot of pressure. And so I think it put a lot more pressure on arrangement decisions, for example. Which hadn't been there in the first couple records and wasn't there when we started writing songs again in 2017. It was just like baby steps, I was newly back. The band had been inactive for a couple of years, and it was just sort of like, do we really want to be doing this? If we're going to do it, let's just no pressure, no stakes. We're going to record a couple songs. We'll drop them on Bandcamp. If people like them, they like them. If they don't, they don't. And that's how we did it for a couple of years for Thrashing Through the Passion and Open Door Policy. And it allowed for a lot more experimentation, and it allowed for, and because we were demoing a lot of this stuff at home, because we didn't all live in the same place anymore, it allowed for a kind of proof of concept experimentation. So, only speaking for myself, but I know from hearing other people's demos that they were doing similar stuff. It's like you can just goof around if you don't, and fill out a demo in a mode that's maybe unfamiliar to the band, without having to do that thing in the rehearsal space of like facing down a skeptical band and say, no, here, I'm kind of hearing like a drum feel, like in trying to articulate what you're hearing. No, you can sort of mock it up, and run through the patches, and try something. I bought this synth pack that was all samples of old Soviet synths that are sort of half broken and half out of tune. And some of them were incredible sounds. I ended up using one of them on the bridge of Heavy Covenant off of Open Door Policy. This old Soviet synth sound. It's in my laptop. It didn't exist in my keyboard. So if we were in the practice room, I never would have used it. So a lot of that stuff comes from having a little bit of that private downtime to like run through a bunch of sounds and see if there's anything. I have a little folder of sounds that I've never used on a Hold Steady song, but I think might be cool at some point in the future if the time is right. So that sort of thing.
And I think you've made one of the most robust defenses. I know there's lots of downsides to the remote approach to work, and people really miss that, sitting in the studio together, and that doesn't happen as often. But I think you've just made a wonderful counter argument to there are some upsides to that.
If you get people collaborating on collaborative songwriting is wonderful. But one of the things that it does is it tends towards a lowest common denominator. Or a nicer way of putting that is if you have a bunch of people in a room and their Venn diagrams of what they think sounds good is going to overlap in a very specific space. And so what you're going to end up with after a couple records is a lot of songs that live in that space.
That's right.
Which can be a wonderful space, right? So like that's the Boys and Girls in America space after the five of us got used to each other, right? That's where our Venn diagrams intersected. But what the remote writing thing allows us to do is to come up with these different ideas, and you just, you throw them all in the folder. And if Craig doesn't feel like he can work with it or doesn't see where the lyrics are going to go, that's fine. Like it doesn't have to be a Hold Steady song. But if it does, it's going to get played by those same six guys, and it's going to come out the other end sounding like a Hold Steady song. It's going to sound like the Hold Steady because it's played by the Hold Steady. And then after it's recorded by the Hold Steady, then you've expanded the parameters of what the Hold Steady sounds like. So that's my argument in favor of that sort of approach.
No, great point. And so, I mean, 9 albums in and 20 years in, Franz, let's talk about how you actually manage sounds and patches and everything, like on this last tour. What is your touring rig now? And assuming you're obviously doing a lot of backlining as well, how do you keep it all, together and cover the breadth of the back catalogue?
Yeah, it is mostly backlining. I have a Nord Stage 3, which was a new development for me in the pandemic. I'm not a tech head. I'm not one of those guys who loves to talk about tubes and voltages and the XT this and the VXY that. I'm basically a guy who plays piano and and so I settled when I just had, when I joined World Inferno, I joined with like the crappy old Roland JV80 that I had bought in the high school and sort of schlepped to New York and very quickly destroyed. I bought a motif, like the first Yamaha motif, because it had a pretty good breadth of sounds and a good acoustic. I mean, the starting point for me is always a good acoustic piano sound. And we're talking 2002. The Nords that were on the scene at that point, the piano sound was fucking hot garbage. And that really turned me off Nord for, the better part of 2 decades. I didn't even consider it. And then once I was in the Yamaha ecosystem, it's like, I knew the presets, I knew the sounds. The motif was too heavy to tour with, and so I got the S90 and then the S90 ES, and that's what I played live and on records. I would rent one in England, and then eventually one of them flew to England and lived in a storage space there. But yeah, the Yamaha S90 ES was for touring and sessions if they didn't have acoustic instruments for 15 years. But then I was already sort of, that instrument it was pretty road weary. It was reaching the end of its life. And I was feeling the limitations of the thing in terms of layering sounds and zones and stuff like that. And the other knock-on effect of writing thrashing and open door policy the way we did, which was writing it remotely and learning them as a band days before we went into the studio, if not in the studio, was that unlike the previous records, I didn't have parts that I had worked out on tour that I was just going to play in the studio. And so you come up with all these layered parts in the studio that then you have to recreate. That was a new experience for the most part. And so I needed a thing where I could really put together layers and zones to be able to recreate these things. And I knew I could do that on the Nord. I went out and to the as you do, I went to the music store and tried a couple of keyboards, and it's like, these things are expensive and I'm not rich, and but I haven't bought a new one since 2007, so I can probably justify it. And then the pandemic hit, and we were all saving some money, so then I could really justify it, and I could, after the kids went to sleep, eat an edible and stay up figuring out how the thing worked and programming all my presets and get it together, and I rolled it out on a live stream show at the end of 2020, and it's a learning curve a little bit anytime you're moving to a new computer ecosystem, but and the way we do it now with a lot of backline and fly-ins, I love to be able to just fly with my laptop and download the presets before sound check. I mean, that's incredible. And to have the set list in there and just go next song, next song, next song.
No, that's great. So it sounds like you're pretty much running everything off the Nord Stage 3 and loading in, if there's something particularly different, loading it in as a sample or whatever, and you're running it all from there, which sounds great.
Yeah. So, for example, there's a couple songs that have tubular bells patches, and anyone who's tried to work with tubular bells patches will know that the enharmonics or the overtones can be so out of tune that it becomes impossible to play in a band context. So, the actual good tubular bells patches, I had to go through a bunch of them. I ended up just resampling the tubular bells patch from the old Yamaha into the Nord because it wasn't as good, but it stayed as good, quote unquote, as an accurate sample of tubular bells, but it worked. It sounded in tune in the context of the band.
That's right. And so across all those bands, Franz, one of our common questions is the old train wreck question. So whether it's the Hold Steady or any of your previous outfits where you've had something spectacularly go wrong.
Yeah, well, I have two things that leap immediately to mind. One is that in the first years of the Hold Steady, we were a pretty hard drinking band, and so there were a bunch of shows that ended in train wrecks. But I definitely the one that's burned into my mind is that piano. The problem with those Hold Steady songs is a lot of them have these exposed piano breaks, and so after a certain point, I got to remember: is it this one? Is it that one? And in the break of Chicago Seemed Tired last night, the lyric going into it is, "You got to admit the band's pretty tight." And then I have a piano solo, and I totally shanked it. I don't know. Sometimes you just look at the keys, and it's as if it's a foreign language. And I totally blew it. And Craig looked over and he said, "Do you?" And just like that embarrassment, that shame, that's like the worse than the look of death, from the band leader is, "You got to admit the band's pretty tight." Maybe not.
That's great.
The other one, because it's fairly fresh, is I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but we played the Minnesota State Fair, our first state fair gig, which is I think a milestone in any band's career. Is that I went out on the biggest headline show we've ever played. Most tickets we've ever sold. Amphitheater show. Sound check, everything was fine. It's all good. And I went out, and whoever had set up who had moved my rig back out had plugged the pedals into the wrong holes in the back of the keyboard. So the stereo output, one was in the left output and one of them was in the headphone jack. And the sustain pedal was God knows where. The program switch pedal was God knows where. And so again, like first song, stuck between stations, big exposed piano solo with no working sustain pedal. So I'm out. If I had made it to that point in the song with no sustain pedal, it would have sounded like honky tonk. It would sound ridiculous. So I'm sort of like futzing around in front of the, trying to replug everything, and in the first minute 30 of the song. That was not a great one.
No, but great, yeah, great train wrecks though. Thank you, Franz. They're brilliant. The other question we quite commonly ask our guests is to tag a keyboard player. Is there someone, over your career to date that you've really admired or been inspired for that you'd love to hear more about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, Garth Hudson is really my guy.
Yeah,
but he's not available for podcasts, I don't think, at this point.
No, he's not.
But he's really, for me, he's the epitome of the adventurous, skilled, tasteful, how to be a keyboard player in a rock band.
Great.
I mean, there's all kinds of people. There's like, I would love to hear from Geraint Watkins, who plays with Nicolay. Bob Andrews from those the Rockpile records, I think, and the early Nicolay records. Scott Thurston would be really fascinating, I think, to talk to.
Yes.
Because for a guy who played keyboards in the Stooges and the Heartbreakers, like, what an incredible career, just those two. Terry Adams, NRBQ.
Oh, yes.
Would be really cool. And then there's like all these people. I'm always, Ben Montench, Steve Naive. There's no lack of, I guess, they're bigger names in the keyboard world.
Yes.
There's a guy called Ted Boyce. I don't even know how to pronounce his name. Bois, who plays on all the Destroyer records. Who's a really interesting pianist. I basically don't know anything about him. He's a Canadian.
I like it. That's lots of homework for me, Franz. Brilliant. And just for the record,
I know like some of the other names come up. Like I heard Jenny Conley talking about Jay Gonzalez, who's a wonderful guy. He would be a great guy to talk to.
So I'm fascinated that you've mentioned Jenny, because even though musically there are such enormous differences, one of the things I love about the Hold Steady is it has that same, I don't know what it is, passion, emotional depth of the Decemberists. I've always sort of put you guys in similar buckets, even though musically there's a lot of differences. So it's fascinating you mentioned Jenny there, and let alone the Accordion brethren.
Yeah, I mean, that's how she first came to my attention. It was like, there were a couple of us that were, there was a generation of indie rock bands that had accordions. It was like myself and Jenny Conley and the woman from Arcade Fire, all sort of at the same time. And, and plus Gogol Bordello at the same, who were the big band out of that Balkan music scene that I was talking about in New York. I think I have a whole theory about that, which is that there were so many accordions sold in the 40s and 50s, millions, more accordions sold than guitars. And then my parents' generation was appalled, but, thought it was the corniest thing in the world. So when my grandparents' generation started passing away, my parents' generation started cleaning out those accordions from the attics and putting them up on Craigslist or wherever. And so you could get like pretty decent accordions for $100 here and there. And so people my age started picking them up and being like, hey, well, what can I do with this? And, all of a sudden there's accordion players in a bunch of bands at the same time.
No, I like the theory. I think it's very valid. Now, Franz, the dreaded desert island disc question, 5 albums that if you had to go to a desert island and only could have 5, what would they be?
Yeah. American Music Club's Mercury, a mind-blowing record for me as a teenager. There was that prompt going around on the social medias in the last couple of weeks, a perfect album that came out when you were 16. And for me, it's American Music Club Mercury, because it was a sophistication of songwriting that I hadn't really encountered up until that point in a contemporary band. And also a subtlety in the accompaniment and the production that I hadn't really encountered, and some beautiful piano playing that for a long time I thought was Bruce Capin, the pedal steel player in that band, and now I think that it might have been Mitch Froome, the producer, because I talked to Bruce once, and he looked at me like I had 4 eyes when I was talking about how much I loved what an influence that piano playing on that record had on me in terms of like the kind of piano playing you could do in a rock record. So I think maybe it wasn't him. So that's one. There's a record called the Ellington Suites that has it's a collection. I think it was a CD collection that might have come out in the 90s, and that's why I have it that way. But it's the Queen's Suite, it's the Aurelus Suite, I forget what the third one is. The second band record, the Brown record.
Yep.
That was a big one for me in all kinds of ways, not least sartorially.
Yes.
Trying to think of a good piano solo record. Andrew Hill live at Montreux. Andrew Hill is a piano player who had a big. My piano teacher in college was Frank Kimbrough, the late Frank Kimbrough, great jazz pianist, and he had been working on reviving the reputations of 2 sort of half-forgotten jazz pianists, Herbie Nichols and Andrew Hill, and he took me to see and meet Andrew Hill at one point, and it was really sort of mind-blowing. And both as a composer, I think he's an incredible and really fascinating composer. He sort of sits halfway between. He's obviously Monk influenced, but sort of halfway between Monk and 20th century classical composition, which is a place I love to live in. the Charles Ives Fourth Symphony
Great.
was another huge one for me, especially the first movement, which is a very short one. And Ives was a composer that I always felt there's something about him being from New England and writing about being from New England and being from one of these small New England towns, with the parade bands marching through it in the summer and the mountains and the rivers, that I really, and sort of the way he was able to bring in traditional American music. His childhood was in the 1880s and mine was in the 1980s, but there was a continuity in terms of the experience that I really identified with. And that sort of transcendentalist wonder at the divine suffusing all of this, gritty, rocky New England landscape. I grew up, on a mountain, up in the woods, and I had that feeling that I had as a kid stepping outside when there was 3 feet of snow on the ground and the coyotes were up on the mountain and it was, a million stars and a bright moon. That sort of like experience of like, it is kind of a religious experience. Mm-hmm. And I could feel that in the music of Charles Ives when I encountered it. So I don't know if
brilliant.
that's brilliant. If that's 5.
I think you've hit 5 there. Great work. And just being aware of time, Franz, but keen to get one piece of input from you from what we usually would call our quickfire 10 is, what's a piece of gear you'd like to see invented as a keyboard player that currently isn't?
A decent keyboard amp. I feel so strongly about this. I only ever get those fucking Roland, whatever they are, that, I play in guitar bands, right? Guitars are loud. Keyboard amps are never going to be able to compete with guitar amps. I'm always, banging. I'm always banging. 128 is, velocity at all times, and you can as if that's ever going to compete. And I mean, I think anyone who's ever tried to play piano sounds through those garbage amps knows that they just can't reproduce it, that they're going to distort on the low end and you get this tinkle, tinkle, tinkle on the high end. And it really affects the way you play. One of the reasons I think keyboard players get a chip on our shoulders is that we're the one instrument who you can go years without ever playing your real instrument on stage. True. I can count on one hand the time I've played an acoustic piano with a rock band on stage. I've never played a Hammond organ on stage.
No,
once I think I got a Wurlitzer. So
that's right. No, a very, very valid point. And just 2 supplementaries then to that. Have you ever tried a PA speaker like an EV or one of those PA? Because that's what I use, and they're so much better than the amps, but still may not meet your needs.
So how does it work though? Do you need a PA head on stage with you?
No,
also?
no.
You
So it's an integrated unit. So EV is the one I use, and there's another. It's got the word space in it. I'm having a mental blank. There are 2 really great brands, and by God, the volume is better and the clarity is 10 times better than some of those amps.
You got to email me what that is.
I will do.
I'm 25 years deep, and I've never found a keyboard amp that even comes close to being acceptable.
And I'm assuming the whole steady under an in-ear monitor band.
I am now an in-ear monitor person as of a year or 2 ago, because it became unsustainable.
Yeah.
When I rejoined the band, it was hard enough in the early years, but at least Tad was on far stage left and I was on far stage right. When I rejoined the band, in the meantime, Steve Selvage, who's a wonderful guitar player and a wonderful guy, but then we were sharing stage right. And a couple of years of volume wars, and it's like, it's nobody's fault. No. He wants to hear how he's doing, and I just had to go to in-ears. The downside of which is I'm hardwired, so it cuts down on my range of motion substantially.
No, absolutely.
But I can hear every note I'm playing for the first time in my career, which is a little disconcerting. You start wondering, have I always been this sloppy? And I just couldn't hear before. The answer is probably yes, unfortunately.
It's worked. It's worked, Franz.
Yeah.
Franz, my last question probably for you is, what's the next 12 months hold for you? What's on the horizon?
Well, there's Hold Steady shows, not as busy as the previous year. We are going to be in Australia in May.
Yeah, so actually, and I understand you may not be able to answer this question, Melbourne only at this stage, so I totally get you may not be able to answer this. Any chance of other locations?
I think no.
No, okay,
the short answer.
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah,
I think the decision has been made. I mean, that's sort of the way we're doing it now. Is that we're trying to make a place a destination.
Yeah, fair enough. And you pick one of the best cities. So
and we announce it far enough in advance, ideally, that people have time if they want to come to the show that they can make those arrangements.
Because you're doing, I think, a series of 3 dates from memory.
3 dates,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, which is great.
I'm going to do another solo tour. I'm going to go back to England for festival season in the summer and hopefully get over to Germany. Band People's going to come out in September on University of Texas Press, and I'm going to start writing another novel.
Great.
I mean, I have started, but I'm going to now that I'm getting this other book finally off my desk, I can really turn my attention to it in a real way.
That's brilliant. And look, I'm excited for all those outputs. And yeah, the Band People, as soon as University of Texas do up a pre-order, I'll be online for that one. Cannot thank you enough. I know we barely scratched the surface, Franz, but hugely appreciate the time. And yeah, if I can save my pennies, I'm hoping to get to Melbourne and would love to follow up with you in the future. But yeah, thanks so much for giving up part of your Friday night.
Yeah, please do let me know if you're coming to Melbourne. I'd love to talk more.
And there we have it. Huge thanks to Franz on a Friday night for giving up his time. It was an absolute buzz to have him on the show. Do check the show notes. We're always very conscientious in linking to each of our artists' work. If you are unaware of the Hold Steady and you like great rock and roll, they are touted sometimes as the world's best bar band, and I wouldn't disagree with that, but they are so much more than a bar band. The stories and the lyrics in those songs are incredible. So yeah, do check that out, let alone all the other amazing links. Fran's solo albums are superb. He's a great singer in his own right. And I, for one, am going to order each of his books because I've read some snippets and they are amazing as well. So yeah, huge thanks to Franz, and hopefully we'll catch him in Melbourne on tour. But mostly thanks again to you for joining us. We always appreciate it. This episode will be sort of hitting the feeds either at the very end of 2023 or the very start of 2024. Thank you for the year that was. Hopefully next episode, Paul will be back. Paul's had an incredibly busy touring season, which is what any musician wants. So yeah, but this certainly wouldn't happen without Paul's input as well. And he is missed when he's not here. A quick shout out to our gold and silver sponsors, Brother Paul Brown from the Water Boys. Hopefully Brother Paul's having a bit of a break over Christmas. He sure as hell deserves it. Always appreciate your support, Brother Paul. Speaking of also deserving a break, Tammy from Tammy's Musical Stew. Hope you do get some good festive downtime, Tammy, and we appreciate your support as well. Midnight Mastering. Now, Mike at Midnight Mastering probably isn't going to rest. He's probably busily mixing and or mastering a bunch of tracks, but also has some amazing turnaround times. If you are after someone, a sort of fresh set of ears to master your own work, do give Mike a call or an email. Probably is better. Call. Why don't you fax him at midnightmastering.com. And also, last but definitely not least, the musicplayer.com forums. Highly recommended for any keyboard player that wants to get in and talk nitty-gritties of anything from performance, technology, and a whole lot more. So we'll be back again in a couple of weeks. Again, thank you for your time and keep on playing.